And so here we are today. I'm here to bring the message to you. So I'm so excited about what God has to tell you today. So just if you're in the chat and you haven't said anything, take a minute and just say hello to everybody. Say hi, how are you doing? Man, it's great to see all of you guys. And when you interact, it so helps us just to see that everybody's doing well and is there. It's been a great week. I feel like the summer is here and officially, and I love the weather and love what's going on. And I can't believe that July is next week. That's still like blowing my mind every minute I think about it, that July is here and is happening. But, summer's here, and man, it's a good thing. But if you haven't been paying attention, we are in a series called Churchology, and we've been working through a bunch of different thoughts about the church and what it means and what's going on with all of it. And we've been sort of tackling some different angles and some different topics. And so we're going to continue in that series today. And I've got just a thought for you today, a whole sort of like idea that I've been sort of working through and walking through for probably this past season amidst all of the, whatever you want to call this, the COVID-19 season. But it's been on my heart, and I just felt like I just settled into it a little bit and just want to talk about it. And before we get into that, I want you to think through the idea of events, how important events are, and how much of a part of our lives events are. When you think about life events or things that have gone on around your life and things that happen to you, and almost everything is some kind of event, right? Even the moment you came into this world, you were born, that was an event, right? Even the moment that you took your first step or had your first diaper changed, or every part of our lives from that day up until now really has been this like series of a bunch of different events. And some of those events were just whatever. I'm sure the first time that your diaper got changed, you probably don't remember, right? You probably have no recollection of that. Your parents might, and I'm sure your father might, because the first time a dad changes that very first diaper, it is very life-changing. It's a very transformative event, because that first diaper is like not just regular, it's some sort of weird alien substance that has this bizarre consistency like tar that won't wipe off anything, and it's black and it's weird. So that's a transformative event for your dad or your mother in and of itself. But that event meant nothing to you. And so think about just those two sides of that thought. For some people, that event was a big deal. For others, it was virtually nothing. We don't even remember it. When I think about events in our lives, events that have happened, things that we've done, things that have happened to us, and I was just been thinking more and more about how these events, how we react to them, what we do with them, and what they mean to us, and how in some ways you could almost say life really is a series of events. That the culmination of everything that's happened to you has been a bunch of events. And so you remember a couple weeks ago when I talked about movies, and I asked you to put your favorite movie in the chat. Now this week, what I want you to do, take a minute, and I want you to think about one of the most transformative, important events of your life. What's the event that you look back on, and I know there's probably more than one. Obviously, there's probably dozens. Hopefully, there's more than one. Hopefully, you haven't just had one event that's happened to you. But I want you to look back in your life, and I want you to think about an event that truly changed your life or truly transformed what was going on. And maybe it was a super positive event. Maybe it was a negative event. Maybe something bad happened to you. I think for a lot of us, the biggest events, I hope, are things that were good things that happened to us. But for some of us, those huge events are not. I know for me, one of the transformative events in my life was when I turned 15 years old, and it was time for me to figure out job, right? Like that was back when I was a kid, when I turned 15, you had to start thinking about a job before you can even drive. And so I went around and I applied at a bunch of places. And as you're aware, when you're 15 years old, there's not a whole lot of jobs that are like really cool that are available to you. It's mostly jobs that no one else wants to do that then get regulated to, those 15-year-olds. And so for me, like I was looking for a different job. And so I applied at a bunch of different places. And the first one that called me back was Cracker Barrel. And so it was a restaurant. And I know I've probably told this story before. Some of you are very familiar with it. But it was very transformative for me. And so I feel like it's very much a part of my life. And so as I, showed up for the job, the very first thing that stuck out to me that I should have paid attention to was when in my interview, the guy said, a lot of people leave this job after the first day. Do you think you'll do that? And it was such a strange question. And of course, when you're in an interview, you're not going to say, yeah, I will. Of course I'll leave after the first day. No, you're going to say, no, there's no way, I'll make sure that I work really hard. I'm just really important to me. Now that I should have paid attention to that, like that phrase that he said should have stuck out to me. Like, why would he say that, right? Like, why would that even be important right now? And so the job was to dishwash and to bus tables. And so I showed up for work, my first day of work. There was an hour-long training video to show you how to wash dishes, which is pretty sad that if you really need an hour-long training video to show you how to wash a dish, I mean, some people may need that, but it was pretty simple. You put it in a machine and it washed it for you. But for me, watching the training video and then getting into the actual nitty-gritty of it, and when I tell the story, the funny part for me is that I wasn't even washing the dishes. I was just wiping them off because so many people sent their plates back with food. And after wiping off so many different dishes, when your hands get like real wrinkly from being in the bathtub or being like in a pool? My hands were completely all wrinkly from the amount of chicken, what is it? The chicken and dumplings. I don't know if you've had chicken and dumplings at Cracker Barrel, right? It's like chicken in a gravy and a dumpling. My hands were wrinkly from the amount of chicken and dumplings that I had wiped off of the number of plates. And to this day, I still remember the moment that I looked at my hand and that guy's words came into my memory where he said, a lot of people leave this job the very first day after doing it. And as I looked at my hands, suddenly those words made complete sense. And I was like, wow, I realize why people leave this job. Now, I wish the end of the story I could tell you that I stuck it out anyway, that I showed up again to work some more, but sadly I did not. Sadly, I never returned again to that job. That was a transformative event. That changed my life. I'll never forget that. And so it made me look at work and Cracker Barrel and chicken and dumplings in a whole new way. Now, some of you guys are saying things that, to me, are much better events to remember than that one. Things like the birth of a child. Corey said the first time that he saw a horror movie that it messed him up. I can remember days like that. Pastor Peggy says becoming a life coach was a transformative. I saw Brittany said giving birth to her kids, and Craig almost passing out. Aw, Craig. That's cute. Good job, Craig. You made it though, right? Corey said, Corey, you got a lot today. The last time Michigan beat Ohio State was a big event. Were you even alive when that happened?
It was like 9 years ago.
9 years ago. Yikes. Yes. I agree. For me, if I'm being real, the birth of kids is a super amazing event. When you've got X amount of people in the room, let's say 5 people, including the doctors and nurses, and then suddenly there's a 6th person in the room, it is a very surreal, powerful, beautiful moment. I can see, Craig, you were overcome by the love and the emotion that you felt in that moment. You weren't overcome by the blood or the birth. It was just so powerful and beautiful when you saw Lucas being born that you just got overwhelmed. I get it. That happens to all of us. And so a lot of times these events, these things that happen to us, these transformative things that happen to us, they appear oftentimes very powerful, but not every event is like that. And I looked up the word event because I thought this might help some of you connect with why I'm talking about this. When you look up the word event and you think about synonyms for events, look at what some of them are. An adventure is like an event, right? You ever been on a great adventure, maybe a vacation or maybe a trip to the hardware store when you were going to try to repair something, went from just being a trip to the hardware store to a whole new adventure. A catastrophe, I love that word. Anybody ever had a catastrophic event happen in your life? Your basement floods, that's very, very real to me. I understand the catastrophe of all of that. Maybe your engine fell out of your car while you were driving. That can be very catastrophic, right? A celebration could be an event. Oftentimes we celebrate things that are important to us. A ceremony can be an event. A circumstance or a coincidence, even something small, can sometimes become an event that sticks out to us that has a deeper meaning. Emergencies, episodes, experiences, holidays. Anybody ever had a holiday event? Usually when you invite a bunch of family to something and it's a holiday, that becomes an event, right? Labor Day can become an event. Okay, thanks for that holiday. Christmas can be a great event, or it can be a not so great event. I don't know if you've ever had your kids in tears on Christmas morning. Then it's not a great event when that happens. That's never happened to me, though. I've never had a kid cry. Miracles. When a miracle happens, it can be a huge event. When you see God do something that is supernatural or miraculous in a way that there's no way this could have happened unless God did something. Even a mistake. Sometimes a simple mistake can become a whole event of itself. A phenomenon, a predicament, a shift, a situation, a transaction, a triumph, even a turn in the wrong direction can suddenly become a whole event. Marriage to Tiffany, Cedric, that's a good one. I like that. Brandon said, the first firefight in Kosovo. I can only imagine what that's like. Obviously, Brandon's talking about being in the military and being in a firefight. I imagine that kind of event would be life-changing. Autumn said, the day I met Brian Beauvais. That's cute. Prayed about finding the one that God wanted me to be with for the rest of my life, and 2 months later we met. 21 years later, we're still going strong. Gosh, that's cute. Good job. Gloria, getting pregnant with Donovan, moving back home. Wow. Corey's trying to get in on that love, meeting Amanda Wargo. took him a few times to get there. Craig says the first time you met Douglas Haney. Obviously, when anybody ever meets me, it's an event, right? Like that's just the way it is around here. But these events, all these things, they carry a whole scale of meanings, right? It's not hard to see that some events carry a very deep meaning. Sometimes an event that can happen to us, the meaning is lost to us in the moment, but then later on down the road, we realize, wow, that was a very big deal when that happened. That was a very big event. I didn't notice it at the time, but now looking back, I can see, gosh, everything changed when that happened. Sometimes we don't even realize that something's an event. And this is sad for parents. There was a day that you picked up your child for the very last time. Because you pick up a little kid, and once a certain point they get to the size where you don't pick them up anymore. And there was a day that was the last time that you did that. And that event you may not remember, but that was a significant event, had some meaning. The last time that you met a person before they moved, the last time that you saw a person and then you've just never seen them again. Like some of these events, they happen and we don't even acknowledge or are aware of what's going on. Now, it's not hard for us to see that the events alone are not the sum of who we are, thankfully. The things that happen to us, the things that have happened around us, the things that we've caused to happen, although they definitely affect and impact our life in a myriad of ways, they do not define who you are. You are more than the sum of your events. There's a depth and a meaning and a value to you that is much greater than what's happened to you or what's happened around you. Tony Robbins is a motivational speaker. He says, it's not the events of our lives that shape us, but our beliefs as to what those events mean. Charles Swindoll, a famous teacher, says, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it. Now that, in those quotes alone, you can see that events have a tremendously more powerful thing that how we react or how we respond or what we think about those events are oftentimes way more important than the actual event itself. Your view and your perception of events around you determine their meaning and their impact, which is why I think it makes it so easy to sometimes miss those events, because if we don't stop and recognize the meaning of an event or the purpose of an event or why that event is happening, we can just easily go on to the next event and the next event and the next event. And if we're honest, if we look at the large Big C church, not just our church, not just churches in Port Huron, but the church as a whole, I would say that churches have oftentimes over the years been more concerned with the actual events happening in your life than the meaning and the purpose behind them. What do you mean by that? Well, I mean, sometimes in church we get caught up with what you're doing, not doing, or what's happening to you as being a more obvious indicator of what's going on in your life than the meaning of those events. We get very obsessed almost over the events. Whole churches and theologies and religions have been built on controlling and dictating and telling you what events should be going on in your life on a day-to-day basis. I grew up in some form of Christianity, obviously, and I went to church for a season, and I remember seasons where certain events, certain teachers or certain pastors or certain leaders had certain events that because of how powerful they were in their life, they felt that those same events needed to happen in my life. This is very obvious to you if you're a parent. If you're a parent, the things that happened to you as a child that were good, you want to see them happen again in your children because of what they meant to you. Things that happened to you as a parent that were bad events, you don't want to have happen in your child's life because of what it meant to you. So you want to stop those bad events from happening, and you want to have those good events happening. And you can see as parents, we get wrapped up in that sometimes. We want our kids to do things that they may not want to do or they may not care about, but because of the meaning they had in our lives, we want to steer their life to have the same impact that it had on us. And it sets us up, right? As parents, we get set up for disappointment all the time because we played Little League T-ball and it was such a powerful thing. When little Johnny goes out and plays T-ball and says, I don't like this game, we say, no, you're going to do this because it's going to be awesome and you're going to enjoy it and you're going to love it. And we sometimes make our kids do things because of the experience and the meaning that we got out of it. Is that always a bad thing? Of course not. Is it always a good thing? No. And I think sometimes in life, we create systems in our mind and systems in our life and systems even in our churches sometimes that overemphasize or almost become obsessed with certain events that we so want people to experience what we experienced that we will get so concerned with the events of what's going on in their lives and we'll miss who they are and what they mean. We'll get so focused on an event that we will actually get, crazy about what you did, what you're doing, what you're not doing, what your decisions are in life, and we will completely miss the value of that human being that's so much more important than what they've chosen to do or not do or what's happened to them. I've even seen churches that will close their doors to a person because of certain events that have happened in their life. An easy one to look at is divorce. Some churches don't allow divorced people to lead or to be in any part of volunteering. They don't let them do that. Why? Because of these events that have happened to them. And I'm sure there's 1,000 different theologies about all of that, but at the end of the day, we've put the event that's happened to them on a higher pedestal than who they are. We've elevated the things that mean something so big to us that now we've applied them to them, and now we hold them accountable for those same things. The church at its core is one of the few institutions in our world that has the power. This just is so big to me, and I just really want you to get it, so I really want to word it correctly. The church is one of the institutions in our world that at its core, and you know this, it's at its core, it has the power to connect life events to spiritual things like no other. When we get that right, it's beautiful. If you've ever been to a great prayer meeting, a great worship service, a great message, a great retreat, a great camp, and you had that spiritual moment where you were doing some events and some things happened to you and you had this great spiritual awakening and it was like, oh, I can't believe how I felt God. I remember one time when I prayed over a young man and I didn't even know what I was praying, and I was very young in ministry and I was just trying to come up with something that sounded, helpful or accurate. And so I was praying, and when I was done, I was, you're kind of in that moment after you're done praying, like, okay, did anything happen? Did that work? Do you feel better? And he said to me, wow, I feel like I felt God for the very first time. And I remember that, right? Like that event was so big to me, and it spoke something deeply to him spiritually and personally and profoundly, but it also said something to me about, wow, God used me even though I really didn't even know what I was doing. And it was this incredible moment where this event created something. When the church does well and focuses on things that are helpful and Christ-driven and directed, that connection to those spiritual events is so profound and powerful. But you already know and see where I'm going. When the church isn't doing well with that stuff and gets hyper-obsessed with certain events being the most important events to happen to you in order for you to truly understand and know who God is, then it can turn into what's on this side a powerful, profound thing into an abusive, traumatic, hurtful thing. And sadly, from all of history, the church has done both. I don't know why I need to say this disclaimer, but for some reason I feel like I do. I'm not talking about just our church. I'm talking about church in general. Big C church. We can get so obsessed with what has happened in our lives, a certain event, and we're so wanting you to have the same response to it. And we get so obsessed that we overlook who you are. We overlook what's in you. We overlook the power of what is going on in your life, and we so desperately want to set aside those things and say, here's an event that is important and you should receive and you should understand. And those events can look like any one of those words that I said, some celebrations, some ceremonies, some turns or shifts or phases or cases. And yeah, there's a lot of good, but there's also sometimes where it's not so good. And we're going to talk about a story from the Bible where I believe that this happens right before our eyes. And it's interesting because in this story, it's very easy to miss all the events going on in here, which is very similar in all of the Bible, right? It's very easy to overlook the deeper meaning behind what's going on. And this is in John chapter 11, and I'll give you a second to get there, whether you have your phone or your Bible. I'm believing that you're doing great. I'm believing that you're not getting lost in some of the events that have happened to you in the past that have been traumatic and hurtful. The time that you were at Cracker Barrel and you watched so much chicken and dumplings that your fingers were wrinkly. Hopefully that's never happened to any of you. And hopefully you're better than I was, and you had more character and actually kept the job that you said you would and not just walked out. And I didn't even call. That's what's sad. I didn't even call the next day. I think I was scheduled like 2 days later. I didn't call anybody. I just didn't show up. And I don't even think they called me. I think it was like quite obvious that I was done. Anyway, let's not slant. Cracker Barrel is a great restaurant. I'm not saying I don't hate Cracker Barrel because of that. I just don't want to wash any more chicken and dumplings off the plates. That's all. In John chapter 11, we have an event that's like one of the most epic events in Jesus' whole miracle signs and wonders. In John chapter 11, we have a whole long story, and it's the story of the resurrection or the return to life of Lazarus, okay? And it's this really powerful thing. It's really the last miracle, at least according to John, that happens before he goes to the cross. And some people think that's very significant, and I think it is, but we're not going to talk about that so much today. But in John chapter 11 is sort of this great big deal thing that happens. We're just going to kind of go verse by verse. Hopefully you're able to follow along. I think that'll help you. But it's John chapter 11, and here's verse 1. Starts like this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Let's pause there for a second. If there's any better way for me to illustrate how important events can be in your life, here is one right here, right? The event of Mary pouring perfume on the Lord and wiping his feet with her hair was such a huge event in life that John even mentions it here as a way to identify who he's talking about. I want you to think about that. That event, that she did that event was so powerful to people, even in that room, that they paid so much attention to it, that it became such an important part of her, that it literally is used to identify who she is. Think about that. Think about the power that event had to create even a narrative around who Mary was. And yet, I can even say, even in that instance, that event is not all that Mary was. Let's keep going. Verse 3 says, So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now when he heard this, Jesus said, This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, that God's Son may be glorified through it. So here we get Jesus actually explaining my message to you today. On one hand, you could view this information that sickness and death are imminent and pain and suffering are at hand. But in Jesus' view, this whole information, this whole event is going to have a much deeper purpose and meaning. And how powerful is it that God himself can see the meaning of this event before it even happens? That is so powerful to me. And he speaks it out loud. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus himself looks and sees in an event where some might say, yeah, Lazarus is sick. He's probably going to die. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that by the time this messenger even got to Jesus, Lazarus was already dead. So it was sort of like more of a notification of his death than it really was a, hey, can you come help? And so Jesus himself, though, sees through just the simplicity of this event. Now, the people around him, though, and this is going to become sort of the point of this message. The people around him, though, didn't see it that way. They all perceived and wanted to see a different reality in this sickness and in this death. And this is what I mean when I feel like sometimes the church gets caught up or obsessed with a certain set of events, and instead of seeing a deeper meaning in them, we get kind of lost and tripped up or stumble. So Jesus, when he hears the news, Lazarus is sick, he makes this profound statement in verse 4, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. You could look at that and you could say, oh gosh, Jesus is being cruel. If he loves Mary and Martha so much, why isn't he jumping on some sort of camel or donkey, whatever it is that you ride in those days, and just rushing to her side? Now, like I said earlier, there's a lot of evidence that by the time this message even got there, he was probably already dead. So I don't think that Jesus was so much hesitating because he didn't care. I think we could easily read that into the event. I think if we want to put that belief on that event, we could. And you can see how even in our lives sometimes we see something happen, or we see God delay, or we see God not operate in the timing that we think he should operate in. And so we immediately start to think, gosh, is he cruel? Oh, did I do something wrong? Does he not love me? Does he not care? Does he not understand? Does he not see? So we can start to read into an event as if there's this whole narrative behind it. And we honestly at times don't know that. We don't know that whole narrative behind it, but you see how we can get obsessed with how important that event may be, and why isn't God responding to it in the way that he's supposed to? And mentally, I think we can even break down and get lost in how God didn't respond the way that I thought that he should. And maybe for some of you, that's happening even right now in the midst of this event, in the midst of this whole virus, in the midst of this whole lockdown, in the midst of this whole society, whatever you want to call it. You're getting lost in the event of all these things of maybe God's timing or this or that, and maybe we're missing, or we're not seeing the greater purpose of what God wants to do with this. Could it be that it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it? Could it be that there's a much deeper meaning to whatever it is that's going on in your life right now? We could read into it that it's just God doesn't care. We could read into it that apparently I did something wrong. Apparently I'm messed up in my thinking. Apparently I should have prayed more. Apparently I should have loved more. Apparently I should have read my Bible more. Apparently I should have given this a whole lot more thought or time. We turn it in ourselves, or we turn it in out there. And I think so often we miss it. We completely miss it. And we see that this is what happens to those around him. In verse 7, Jesus says to his disciples, okay, let's go back to Judea, which is where Bethany was. Now here's what's interesting. The disciples stop him and they say, but Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back? If you read in chapter 10, some really rough things happen to Jesus. He gets called demon-possessed, which, I don't know if you've ever been called demon-possessed. I would imagine that would be a significant event in my life if someone literally told me, you're demon-possessed. especially if it's someone that I actually cared about. That would be rough. If it was somebody I didn't care about, I'd be like, yeah, whatever, you're probably demon possessed, right? I'll just turn that word back around on you. But he gets called demon possessed. A bunch of people decide to stone him, right? Like, in stoning is when you throw rocks at a person till they die. That's not, I don't want anyone to ever suffer that. And he almost gets arrested. And he escapes miraculously, which is all the information that we get, is that he escapes miraculously. And it's fascinating to me that then he says, okay, let's go back there. And the disciples in that moment are already sensing Lazarus is probably dead. What's the purpose of doing this? So they say, why? They don't say it outright, which I love the disciples. There's anybody that can beat around the bush, it's the disciples, right? The real point is that they're scared and they don't want to go there. They don't want to get stoned. They don't want to get arrested. They're tired of Jesus looking bad, getting called demon possessed. They're tired in chapter 10, he says the reason that they do this is because he says things that are very inflammatory and they make people very angry. So they stop him. They want to put a hand to him. And I want you to think through that. When an event like this is going down in your life, how do you react to it? What's your first thought to it? Is it when there's an event that happens especially that requires something uncomfortable of you? Do you reason and try to break it down? And that's not even the point of my message, but that's just interesting to me how quickly they say they want to correct him and say, but wait a minute, Jesus. Now, you may not ever use that language. They didn't just say, hey, wait a minute, Jesus. Right? We don't ever put a hand to God and say, hold on, God, stop. Right? No one ever. I never do that. I always say, yes, God, whatever you want, I will always do, and I will always have the faith required. We may never use that language, but I think a lot of times in the way we think about when events happen in our lives or how we react to an event, a lot of times may not say, hold on, wait, God, but I think sometimes it communicates, hold on, wait, God. This isn't the right time. This isn't the right direction. This is too awkward. This is too uncomfortable. This is too hard. What happens if we get killed? What happens if someone calls me a name? In verse 9, Jesus goes into sermon mode, which is a great thing about Jesus. He says, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It's when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Now, you could miss the point of what he says there, and I think the disciples did, but we don't have to. What he's talking about when he's talking about light and dark is actually faith and fear. When you're walking out of fear and you're in the darkness, it's very easy to stumble. It's very easy to miss where you're supposed to go. It's very easy on that road or on that path to get confused about what direction I should go or what the next step would look like. When we're walking and operating out of fear, it's hard to know what direction to go in or where to go or to have any kind of confidence that it's the right decision. And he says, when they're in the light, they don't stumble, for they have the light with them. They walk in the daytime, will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. He's talking about himself. And so you could say, yeah, that's a good message, Jesus. When we operate out of faith, we know where we're going. When we operate out of fear, we don't know where we're going. But there's a deeper and a bigger point. Because what we want to do is we want to take that faith and internalize it and say, when I walk in faith, then I can see where I'm going. But what Jesus is saying is, I am the light. I'm here with you right now. You don't have to create this faith. It's me. When I'm with you and I'm on the journey with you, no matter what place you go, whether you have fear or you have faith, my light is going to shine the way for you. Who I am is going to go before you. I overcame and have overcome death and sin. You don't have to create this thing. And we miss that narrative and we create this thing about our events that we have to figure all this out and do all this, and we miss the fact that the very Savior that we're searching for to help us get to where we're going is standing right in our midst. And we miss that. And we'll see that they didn't just miss it once, they missed it like 500 times. In verse 11, he says, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. So once again, and this is pretty obvious, I know you know this, when you see that, when they talk about being asleep, they're using an old Jewish way of nicely saying that they're dead. Kind of like when we say someone passed on or passed away. We don't just say they died. We say they passed on, just because I think that kind of feels a little better. So he says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going there to wake him up. The disciples still missing the point. And this is the point that we miss. We get obsessed with the idea of death in this story and how death is overcome. And that's important. I think that's part of the story. But we miss where the life is and where it comes from. We get very focused on that. And I think that's what the disciples and even Jesus is trying to snap them out of, is you're getting so obsessed and so focused on the event of this death happening that you're missing what's right in front of you and what's right next to you. And you always know that I'm getting somewhere when I spit all over my notes. It's a great thing. So the disciples missing the point. Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Why is their understanding so clouded? Why can't they see what he's really saying? Why are they getting lost in this thought, this train of thought that, what is he talking about? Why are we going back here if we could die? If Lazarus is asleep, he'll just get better. They're clouded in their thought because they have looked in the face of fear and they have embraced it. And they have, instead of this event becoming an opportunity for God to do something great, it has become an event that is traumatic and traumatizing to because they've allowed the fear to create this whole narrative about what's going on. Like he just said in verse 9 and 10, why have fear when you're literally in the presence of that which is light? So 13, Jesus has to get clearer. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, right? Have you ever had a mic drop moment where it's like somebody just finally kind of says what everybody's thinking? You ever been in one of those moments or those crowds when no one wants to address the elephant in the room and then someone just does and you're like, oh, well, okay, yeah, I guess we're going there, right? And I feel like that's kind of what happens in this moment. Jesus kind of gets tired of this whole rigmarole that's going on and says, Lazarus is dead. And he says, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. You see, when you're the conqueror of death, when you're the overcomer of death, you can understand and you can see that events like this aren't definitive and aren't final. You don't hesitate when you see an opportunity. You don't stop and get lost in this fearful thought of, what might happen. And then we have verse 16, which is the to me somewhat of the opposite of Jesus' mic drop moment, is now Thomas's mic drop moment. Then Thomas says to the rest of the disciples, let us go that we may die with him. So it's like they all miss the point. And I don't necessarily think that Thomas is being sarcastic here. I think we read sarcasm into things sometimes because we're a very sarcastic culture. I think he plainly does feel like if they go back to this place, they're going to die, that they will die. And again, you can see even in his comment, even in his process, Thomas's whole process. And yeah, I saw someone say they're all sixes. If you follow the Enneagram, Thomas was definitely a 6. And you can see in his realist mindset that we're going to die, so we might as well just do it with Jesus. And I like the fact that when Thomas says this, Jesus doesn't even necessarily address it, because I feel like he has addressed it so much that he's at that place where he's like, all right, whatever. And Thomas says, let us also go that we may die with him. And I feel like this sometimes is the response of the church. We are so sometimes focused on the wrong events of what we're doing and why we're doing that we miss the fact that the overcomer of death is with us. That is with us, that's in us, that's part of us. We're so focused on the wrong part of these events that Jesus died on the cross for our sin, which is so important and so powerful and such a spiritual thing. But his death on the cross didn't start any movements. His death on the cross didn't write any Bibles. His death on the cross didn't start any churches. When he died on the cross and that event happened, it pretty much ended. Everybody went back to their jobs. Only a few of the people closest to him even stuck around in the same area. But when you look past that event and you see the much greater, more powerful event of his resurrection, suddenly you see an event that created a whole movement. Suddenly you see an event that created a whole revolution. Suddenly you see an event where the Bible becomes important and valuable because he came back to life again. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I think oftentimes there is an obsession in the church with death. I think sometimes we've gotten so, fearful, scared. I don't know if sometimes we've gotten hardened. I don't know if we've just gotten frustrated. I don't know if we're just tired of life or tired of what's happening. And I think sometimes we see an event like a virus, a pandemic, and we just see more death. We just see more pain. We just see more suffering. We just see more loss. We just see all of those things. And in times, I think then we get extremely religious about it, and we start to look at events that we're doing or not doing, or what we're saying or not saying, and it's so funny to me how society does. We then draw sides. Everybody's on this side or everybody's on that side, and it becomes like this division thing that happens. And that's what religion does, right? Religion sets everybody in their category. Well, you're in this belief and you're in this belief and I think this, and so let's draw lines between everybody so we know where everybody stands. And I think in these moments sometimes our obsession with the wrong events and our obsession with the wrong meaning behind the events has created so much where we've lost sight of what's even happening, and we've totally lost sight of the fact that the overcomer of death is in our midst, not dead and buried somewhere, but resurrected before our very eyes. And the same resurrection power that flows in his veins flows in ours. And we've lost that event a little bit. And we've gotten focused on many other events to me that, they might be hard, traumatic, and important. I'm not trying to gloss them over just get over all that. Love Jesus. But we have the resurrected life in our midst. And you can see our obsession with death bleeds into all the systems of religion. And I don't want to trample on anybody's theology, but at the same time, if your theology has created this weird misunderstanding of what actually is going on, if your theology you've lost sight of the fact that Jesus is literally right next to you, and your theology has got to this point of, we're all going to die anyway, so whatever. If your theology is kind of tainted, I do want to step on it a little bit. And I see in this story, I see it playing out right in front of our face. If you think that society's collapse is ultimately what's supposed to happen so that God can be glorified, I would rather you look at the God that was glorified in the resurrection and how now that power is in you, and instead of society having to collapse to reveal it, that it could literally be revealed in you right now in this moment. That your world around you doesn't have to get to a place that it's so bad that now God can be glorified, but that power in you is right next to you and with you and walking on the path with you while you say, I'm confused and I don't see it. And you can see the disciples were literally with Jesus at this time, and yet they lost sight of the events. I think oftentimes, and I'll stop picking on it at this time after this, and we'll move on in the story. Oftentimes, I think we get so obsessed with a person's eternity that we lose sight of the reality that they're living in right now. Wow. And we would rather, and not that their eternity is not important, please don't hear me say that. But I think sometimes we've overemphasized the event of your death to the point where we miss the impact and the power of your life. And how Jesus didn't get raised from the dead only to send you to heaven. That he got raised to the dead so that you could experience what John calls the resurrected Zoe life right now, today. Heaven doesn't have to wait. Heaven can be on earth. But let's keep going in the story. I'm probably going to run out of time, but we have to at least get to a little bit later in the verse. So remember we're with Jesus, and he just did this little message with the disciples, and they kind of listened to him, kind of didn't. Thomas and his very fearful mindset, but yet not so fearful that I think he's a coward. I think fearful in the sense that he really realistically sees what's going on and says, well, we're probably going to die. Because he didn't say, I'm not going. He definitely said, let's go. And here's the other thing I like about Thomas. Thomas had the courage and the bravery to actually say it out loud, what everybody else was probably thinking, but nobody wanted to confront Jesus with, right? And I love that about Thomas, that even though maybe he was, a little dramatic or a little Debbie Downer, doubter, whatever you want to call him, but the fact that he could say it out loud, that he could speak a truth to me was very, very big of him. And a lot of people don't do that, but that's another message for another day. So we go on to verse 17. Jesus arrives. He finds that Lazarus has been dead in the tomb for 4 days. And Bethany was less than 2 miles, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Now, I hope you can see, like I can see in that little exchange, Martha's theology prevented her from seeing the resurrected life that was right in front of her. Her theology about what end times meant or whatever the play out of this event looked like, it inhibited her. Her thoughts, the way she was viewing this whole event, the way that she viewed who God was and the power, the way that she decided, the meaning that she decided to take from this maybe even a little bit of an obsession with the suffering and the death. And yes, she was in mourning, so she may not have been in the right mindset. Who knows? But in this moment, she misses the fact that Jesus, the Son of God, shows up. The resurrected power shows up. And even says to her the thing that she wanted him to do. I hope you see this. He says to her, your brother will rise again. Do you ever get a prayer answered but miss the answer? Do you ever be on your knees so long praying for something that you miss the fact that God has already answered and responded? And then yet, instead of saying, thank you, please let him rise again, she almost argues with him. I don't know about you, but when I'm in a conversation and I start it with, I know, that's not always a conversation where I'm hearing what you're saying. If we're having a conversation and I start it with, well, I know, to me that's like, yeah, you get done talking so then I can tell you what I know. I might be putting that in there a little bit, but that's very interesting to me that she says, well, I know Jesus, that he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Her theology completely prevented her from seeing what was right in front of her and the answer to the thing that she prayed for, because she couldn't see that it would be possible. She couldn't see that God would care that much. She bought into the narrative that maybe Jesus didn't. And isn't it interesting oftentimes when we miss the answer to our prayer, but then years later we look back at the event and we realize, oh, wow, God actually did answer that prayer. Whoops. And you can see how quickly, because we get obsessed and we get focused on the wrong part of these stories, these events, these things happening to us, that we step right over the deeper meaning behind it. And we can get in a pattern of, well, the next event, hopefully it heals me. Well, the next event, hopefully it's the financial breakthrough. Well, the next event, hopefully it's the job I've been waiting for. Well, the next event, hopefully I finally feel what I'm wanting to feel. And we can miss the very events that are going on around us that have these credible, powerful, important moments. So Jesus says to her, isn't it interesting that he uses this terminology? Yes, Doug, it's very interesting. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He doesn't say, I resurrect and I give life. He doesn't say, I'll heal your brother and bring him back to life. He responds to her thought and says, I am. Can you see, this is his paraphrase, my paraphrase of what he said. Can you see that the thing you longed for is standing literally right in front of you? Or can you only see that it hasn't happened in the time that you thought it should, or it hasn't happened in the way that you thought it would, or it didn't look like what you thought it was going to look like, or there's too much suffering, or it's too hard, or it's too awkward? I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Notice the reversal of that terminology. And this is kind of getting to the end of my whole thought for you. Notice the reversal there. And I know you see this. I know you see it, even though sometimes we skip over it and we roll right through it. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. We oftentimes normalize the thought that if you die in believing in Jesus, you will live forever in eternity, right? That's sort of our normal thing. If you're going to die, hopefully you've trusted and loved Jesus so you get to have an eternity in heaven and not in hell. But what it says is whoever lives by believing in Jesus will never die. Can you spot the difference where one's focal point of that statement is on the death moment as being the definitive event, and the other side of that statement, the life is the definitive event? Woo! I hope you see that, because that's what he's trying to say. That's what this whole story is really about. Yes, it's about the power that God has to miraculously raise someone from the dead, of course. But underneath is a much deeper meaning. That resurrected life is in your midst. It's in you. It's with you. And you can miss it right in front of your face. You can walk right by it. You can even argue with it. You can even tell it that you know better than it. You can even hold up a hand to it and say, well, we probably shouldn't do that though. Won't we get killed? What if we die? Imagine telling resurrection and life, what if we die? Like, okay. Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here. She's asking for you. So then Mary shows up. She got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had followed had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out. They followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Those were probably professional mourners, which I just have to mention because I learned about professional mourners when I was studying this, and I thought it was so interesting that there's actually professional mourners, people who are paid to mourn with you, and that's probably what these people were. Very fascinating. Look it up if you're interested in that, but it was very interesting to me. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. This is kind of where I'm ending, these last three verses. Your translation and every translation sort of translates this verse 33 differently. Some say he groaned. How do you groan? This one says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now, try to tap into this because they missed the point. Where have you laid him? Jesus asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied, and Jesus weeps. And then the Jews say, see how he loved him? But then some of them say, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And then verse 38, which is the last verse we'll read, Jesus once more, deeply moved, not just deeply moved, groaned and troubled, came to the tomb. Why was Jesus groaning and troubled if he knew the outcome was going to glorify God? Why did he weep? Which is what so many people want this to say, that Jesus loved Lazarus so much. And he was so emotional in that moment that he wept over him. And I don't think so. Not the resurrection and life. And I'm not saying that to say that Jesus didn't care or that Jesus was callous or that Jesus didn't love. I'm saying that because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't Jesus sad over Lazarus' death. Jesus already knew the outcome was Lazarus' life. So what did he groan for? What was he troubled by? What was he sad over? He was sad because out of everybody that he talked to, not a single one of them recognized that the resurrection and the life was literally in their midst. Not his disciples, not Mary or Martha. They all missed it. I think he was troubled more by the fact that they missed this beauty, this power, this resurrection Zoe life that was in their midst, because they were so obsessed and focused on the wrong events and the wrong meanings and what was going on that they missed the most powerful thing they could have ever stood by. They were so afraid and in fear of death and what could happen and what not could happen that they missed it right in front of their eyes. He wasn't groaned and troubled. He already knew that when he said, Lazarus, come out, that Lazarus would stand up and walk out. He had no doubt about that. He wasn't crying over that. He was sad and he was grieved simply because he saw what we were missing. And it made him sad to see humanity that he loved so much miss out on the Zoe life, the resurrection life and power that was right there in their midst, that he knew they deeply longed for. I don't think he was sad in a weird, oh, pity you for not understanding. I think he was deeply grieved and moaned and troubled because, if only they could see that I'm right here. I'm not somewhere far off. I'm not contained in some building. I'm not dead and up in heaven and no longer a part of life. I am resurrection and life. I am the thing that's in the midst of you that you've so desperately longed for and wanted. It's me. It's me. And that's sort of where I hope that as I land at that moment right now, I hope that that awakens you, that this event that's happening around us, it's very easy, and it's interesting to me that it has to do with sickness and death, that this very event that's happening around us can create so many wrong obsessions about all these different things that are going on, and some of them are very legitimate and important and meaningful, and I'm not trying to make them belittle them or make them seem small, but you're in the midst of the resurrection and the life. If you choose to live believing in Him, then death really isn't something that's that scary or frightening. Suffering and pain is, although not fun, okay. I'm with the resurrection and life. I'm with the light. I'm with faith. I'm with love. I'm with joy. I'm with hope. And it's not even me holding hands with it. We're joined as one. We're joined as one with the resurrection and the life. And I get that we're troubled, and I get that we're in doubt, and I get that we're in fear, and I get that there's anger, and I get that there's loss, and I get that there's suffering. And I want it to all end too. But my hope isn't that in the end, then God will finally be glorified. My hope is that in your life and in your living, He will be glorified. Because to me, that's where the true event, and that's where the true meaning, and that's where the true purpose, it shines through in a way that then nobody can deny. The power of the church and the power of the Bible and the power of that movement, yes, the cross was spiritually enormously important, but the resurrection was what birthed it all. I think for us as a church, just like the disciples, just like Mary and Martha, just like those who were grieving, those who were scared, can we turn our attention to the resurrection and life and become captivated? I don't want to use the word obsessed because that's negative, but a captivation of life. Captivated by this amazing Christ that we have in our midst. Captivated by the power of who God is, captivated by the overcomer, the conqueror of death, captivated by Him. My hope is that you will see that today. And it's going to be a journey, I know. But I think in today, it's more important than it's ever been. And not because, the end times are literally happening around us, but because I grieve and I feel the sadness for people that are missing the resurrected power and life that's in their midst. I don't need God to show up and show them how wrong they were. He can show up in my life and show the power and the beauty of who He is. Let me just close in prayer, and you can go express this in however way that you want. Lord, all I can say is thank you. All I can express is how grateful I am, and help me, God, to snap out of this obsession with the wrong parts of the wrong events. Help me, God, to see that what's happening around me is probably less about what has actually happened around me and how I respond and how I react to those things. Help me to awaken and become more captivated by the resurrection and life that's right in front of me, and not so frustrated and angry at the resurrection and life that I don't feel I'm capable of. Help me to open my heart to a greater degree to you so that I can truly understand and see what it is to be one with you. And Lord, no matter where we are in this season, no matter what events are going on, whether good or bad or whatever perception we have of those things, I'm asking, Lord, that you would challenge each and every one of us as we're on this journey. Maybe we're like the disciples and we're just worried and scared about what might happen. Maybe we're like Mary and Martha and life is just so hard right now that we just can't even feel like we see what's right in front of us. And maybe we're like Lazarus and we're just dead and gone in the tomb and not a care in the world, and we've just detached from any relationship we had with the Lord anyway. No matter where we are in this story, I believe that the resurrection and the life has the power to bring our attention back to Him, to captivate us. Not with death, but to captivate us with life. And I'm remembering, Lord, that Paul writes in Corinthians that if we're not acknowledging the resurrection, then literally all of our preaching and all of our faith is useless anyway. I don't want my faith to be useless, Lord. I don't want my preaching to be useless, God. I don't want these events that have gone on around me to, at the end of the day, be useless. So, Lord, we open our hearts to you. We open our minds to you. Help us to be captivated by life. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you want to, I know Pastor Mark encouraged you guys on the live the other day, drive by the church and check out the brick. It's looking beautiful. And man, I'm looking forward to the day when we're in the building again and hanging out. And I know that day is coming. But while I'm here in this season, while I'm in the middle and can't really control the future and wish we could go back to the beginning, I'm going to become captivated more and more by life and not so obsessed with this other stuff. And I hope that you do the same. Amen? Amen. Thank you guys. Hope you have an awesome and wonderful week. We love you.